At first, it was just looks, side eyes, whispered giggles when she walked past. Ariel Ward had only been at Westbridge Academy for 2 weeks, and already, the hallways had made up their minds about her. She was the quiet girl, the awkward one, the black girl who thinks she's better than everyone else. She hadn't said a word to anyone yet. That was enough to make her a target. At a school where wealth walked in designer shoes and privilege was woven into every classroom curtain. Ariel showed up with box braids, pressed slacks, and a second-hand backpack. She brought a book to lunch instead of a phone. She didn't laugh when Savannah cracked jokes about urban names during homeroom. She didn't fake smile in gym class when Chloe asked if her hair was real. She just observed, and that was dangerous. Westbridge wasn't the kind of place that welcomed quiet black girls. It tolerated them barely until they made someone uncomfortable, and Ariel, by simply existing without apologizing, had made them uncomfortable. They didn't understand how a girl who spoke so little could carry herself with such self-respect. She wasn't playing the game, and that made her the enemy. By the 3rd week, things escalated. Her seat was mysteriously wet in algebra. Her locker was jammed with torn-up paper labeled "Go back to DUC." One day, someone took a picture of her eating lunch alone in the courtyard and posted it on a burner account with the caption, "Solitude or just nobody wants her." The photo got 143 likes. Ariel didn't react. She didn't tell a teacher. She didn't cry in the bathroom or lash out in the hallway. She just kept showing up, hair neat, eyes forward, silent. But silence doesn't mean absence, and being calm doesn't mean being weak. The school assumed she was just another scholarship student lucky to be in the room. They were wrong. She wasn't lucky. She was prepared. Ariel didn't come from chaos. She came from structure. She came from a home where books outnumbered screens, where black excellence was not something to prove, but something to protect. What they didn't know, what none of them bothered to ask, was that her father wasn't a janitor or a local pastor or a coach. Her father was a senior official in the United States Department of Justice, a federal civil rights attorney, a man whose job was to hold broken systems accountable. He'd been watching, too closely. And the day Savannah poured a cup of coffee over Ariel's hair in front of the entire cafeteria, it wasn't the beginning of humiliation. It was the end of Westbridge's comfort. Because that was the moment Ariel stopped taking notes, and her father started making calls. This is a story about quiet power, about dignity in the face of cruelty, and about what happens when the people you underestimate are the ones who know the law better than you ever will. Ariel Ward entered Westbridge Academy on a gray Monday morning with the same posture she always carried upright, composed, observant. The school, a sprawling brick campus tucked behind iron gates, boasted one of the highest academic rankings in the state. It was also, unofficially, known as a school for the well-connected. Lawyers' kids, board members' granddaughters, senators' nephews. Ariel didn't belong to that circle, and they made sure she knew it. Her father had told her not to worry about fitting in. You weren't raised to shrink. He'd said, you were raised to think. Ariel took that advice literally. She walked through hallways full of curated appearances, platinum hair, lip gloss, loud sneakers, and never tried to match any of it. Her outfits were clean and pressed. Her shoes were simple but cared for. Her books were always in her hand, in a place where validation lived on Instagram. She didn't even have the app. By the end of week 1, the comments had started harmless on the surface but sharpened just enough to cut. You always dress so proper. Your hair must take forever. You're really quiet. Huh. The girls who led these microaggressions, Savannah, Chloe, and Rachel, weren't obvious villains. They smiled in public. They served as ambassadors at school events. They were the daughters of donors and sat front row at every basketball game. But behind the scenes, they were the architects of social control. And Ariel didn't follow the blueprint. What made her stand out wasn't her silence. It was the confidence underneath it. That's what they couldn't tolerate. She wasn't begging to be included. And in a place where approval was currency. That made her a problem. By week 2, things went from comments to sabotage. Ariel came into math class one morning and found her seat soaked. The teacher looked confused. "Just grab a towel from the closet," he said, and moved on. No one asked why. No one looked around. Her locker, which she always kept organized, started jamming more often. Someone had slipped in pieces of shredded notebook paper that read, "Go back to D.C." She said nothing, but at home, she stayed up a little later, wrote longer in her journal. Her father noticed, but didn't push. "If something's wrong," he'd said, "I trust you'll tell me." She nodded, but she didn't. Not yet. In the cafeteria, things became bolder. One day, Ariel noticed 3 girls staring at her and laughing while scrolling through their phones. By the end of lunch, a classmate showed her a post from a private Instagram account called Ward Watch. It had a blurry photo of her sitting alone at the edge of the courtyard, reading a book. The caption read, "Solitude or just nobody wants her." The post had over 100 likes by the time she got home. Still, she didn't speak up. Not to the school counselor, not to the homeroom teacher, not even to her father. It wasn't about fear. Ariel had been raised to recognize racism not just in its loudest, most obvious forms, but in its subtle strategies. She knew these girls weren't just mean. They were calculating. They pushed just far enough to stay under the radar, and the system built to protect students who belonged would not protect her. That lesson was reinforced when Ms. Patterson, one of the few black faculty members at Westbridge, was reassigned after speaking up in an internal staff meeting about a pattern of exclusion toward students of color. The change happened quietly, over a weekend. By Monday, her name was off the classroom door. No explanation given. No one questioned it aloud. Ariel kept going. She kept her head down and her grades up. But the air was growing heavier. Every day she walked into school felt like entering a building that watched her, judged her, tried to erase her. When she turned in a poem to the school's creative writing magazine, one about finding strength in silence, Savannah somehow got her hands on it and read it aloud in history class with exaggerated dramatics. "Sounds like someone thinks she's Maya Angelou," she said with a snort. The teacher did nothing. The class laughed. Ariel blinked once, then opened her notebook and began writing again. That, to her, was power. By now, even teachers began participating in the erasure. During a class discussion on resilience, a history teacher remarked, "Some people confuse being silent with being strong, but most of the time, silence is just avoidance." Ariel knew that wasn't aimed at anyone else. She said nothing, but that sentence stayed with her all day. When a science project required team collaboration, no one volunteered to work with her. One student even said, "It's hard when you don't know if she's mute or just rude." That same day, Ariel discovered her sketchbook had gone missing. It was later returned, pages torn. A crude drawing left inside mocking her hair. She finally emailed the school counselor, asking for a meeting. No reply. She followed up 3 days later. Still nothing. The silence from the system was louder than the bullying. It told her, without saying it, this is normal here. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting day, she sat on her bed and reread a letter her mother had written years ago. Her mom, a social worker, had once written, "Sometimes the quiet ones aren't hiding. They're planning." Ariel looked at herself in the mirror, then at her bookshelf, then at the framed photo of her and her dad in front of the Lincoln Memorial. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She started documenting every incident, every name, every post, every ignored email, and still, the school remained silent. Until one day, everything boiled over in a single act that was meant to humiliate, but instead marked the beginning of a reckoning. That day would be remembered not because of the cruelty, but because of what came next. It started with a missing textbook. Ariel always kept her materials organized. She placed her U.S. history book on her desk in fourth period, turned for just a second, and when she turned back, it was gone. The teacher barely looked up when she raised her hand. "Check your locker again," he said, and moved on. She knew she hadn't misplaced it. Later that day, she found the book stuffed behind a toilet in the girls' bathroom, soaked and torn down the spine. No one claimed responsibility, but someone had written, "You don't belong here" in pencil across the inside cover. That night, Ariel didn't say a word at dinner. Her father, Isaiah Ward, noticed the quiet had shifted into something deeper. He watched her eyes, the tightness in her shoulders, the way her hand hovered over her notebook like she wanted to write but couldn't. Still, he said nothing. He had learned not to rush his daughter's truth. She would bring it to him when she was ready. For now, he trusted her strength because he had raised her to understand the difference between endurance and silence. The next week, things escalated again. During a group science project, the teacher asked students to pair up. No one chose Ariel. Savannah smirked and said loudly, "Maybe she can just work with herself. She doesn't need people." Right. Laughter rippled across the room. Ariel remained still. The teacher sighed and assigned her to work with a student who visibly rolled their eyes, even when assigned a partner. Ariel's presence was treated like a burden. The same day, she opened her locker to find her personal journal, one she had never shared with anyone, ripped apart and thrown across the floor. How someone had gotten it, she didn't know. But she recognized her own handwriting sprawled on the floor, pages torn and scribbled over. A sticky note was placed in the center. "Write this. Loser." That evening, she sat in her room, lights off, laptop open. She began compiling everything: screenshots of the posts, timestamps, blurry photos, classroom incidents. She listed the teachers who looked away, the emails that had gone unanswered, the meetings she had requested. Every entry was labeled with date and time. She titled the document "Ignored and Unspoken." But it wasn't until 3 days later that the cruelty reached its breaking point. It was lunch. The cafeteria was loud with its usual mix of chatter and clicks. Ariel sat in her regular spot, back corner, by the window. She was halfway through a chapter of Beloved when she sensed the air change just slightly. She looked up to see Savannah walking toward her, coffee cup in hand, Chloe and Rachel following close behind. Savannah smiled that calculated, sweet-smelling smile. "Oops," she said loudly, as if announcing a stage cue. And then, without hesitation, she tilted the cup and poured the entire contents down onto Ariel's head. The cafeteria went silent for a second. Then came the laughter, gasps, the sound of phones clicking into record mode. Hot coffee soaked into Ariel's braids, onto her collar, and pooled onto the table, ruining her book. For a long moment, she didn't move. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She slowly placed her damp book into her bag, reached for a napkin, wiped her face with a precision that was almost ritual, and stood up. Her eyes scanned the room, calm and terrifyingly composed. Then she turned and walked out. Not a word, not a glance back. That silence shook the room more than if she had flipped the table. One student muttered, "Why didn't she say anything?" Another whispered, "Yo, that was too far." But the damage was already done, and so was the recording. By the end of the school day, the video was already circulating through private group chats and burner accounts, captioned "Coffee and Consequences." It showed Ariel soaked, silent, unmoving. Most comments mocked, some questioned. A few said nothing, just reposted. When Ariel got home, she didn't cry, she didn't rant. She opened her laptop, saved the video to her archive, and added it to her folder. She renamed the file "This is the Line." That night, her father came home late from a meeting with federal colleagues. When he walked into the living room and saw her waiting, notebook on her lap, file opened on the screen, he knew. She didn't need to explain. She simply said, "It's time." Isaiah Ward didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He sat beside her, scanned the folder, and read every word. Then he opened a new browser tab and logged in to a federal portal. "Let's start with this," he said quietly. "We'll escalate tomorrow." But Ariel had already done more than prepare a file. She had already sent a copy to the school principal, CCing 2 board members, the counselor who had ignored her emails, and an anonymous tip line maintained by the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. The subject line was short: "Ongoing pattern of discrimination and harassment at Westbridge Academy." What happened next would ripple far beyond the walls of a cafeteria. Because this wasn't just about a cup of coffee. This was about systemic racism in education, about school bullying swept under the rug because of status, about a culture that tolerates cruelty as long as the target stays silent. But Ariel Ward was silent no more, and her father, a high-ranking federal civil rights attorney with the DOJ, had waited long enough. This was the moment he'd been preparing for, not just as a parent, but as a professional who knew exactly how these systems operated and how to hold them accountable. The school thought they had poured coffee on a quiet, powerless girl. What they had done was pour gasoline on the fuse of a long overdue reckoning. By the time Westbridge Academy opened its doors the next morning, the video had already reached the inboxes of people it was never meant to reach. But that was no accident. Ariel's email with its quiet, clinical subject line had begun making its way through administrative layers like a slow, precise fire. Unlike the typical bullying complaint, this wasn't emotional or frantic. It was structured, labeled, documented, time-stamped. It carried the weight not just of a student's pain, but of a system's neglect. And it wasn't just a teenage girl asking for help. It was the daughter of a federal civil rights prosecutor putting the school on notice. At 8:45 a.m., Principal Henderson was called out of a department meeting and handed an urgent message. "Mr. Isaiah Ward from the DOJ is requesting an in-person meeting. He's already in the lobby." There was no time to prepare, no room for spin, because Isaiah wasn't alone. He entered wearing a tailored gray suit, a quiet storm behind his calm eyes. With him were 2 attorneys from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division and a representative from the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. They were polite, professional, and efficient. They didn't speak in hypotheticals. They spoke in citations, case law, and precedent. This wasn't a parent-teacher conference. This was the beginning of a federal inquiry. Isaiah slid a folder across the table. "I'm here on behalf of my daughter, but also on behalf of every student who's been silenced, marginalized, or ignored in this institution, he said evenly. Inside the folder were documented reports, screenshots of racially charged posts, evidence of retaliation, and, most importantly, emails. Emails that showed repeated cries for help met with bureaucratic silence. Principal Henderson stammered through a generic apology, blaming internal miscommunications and policy misalignment, but the room had shifted. The power dynamic wasn't with the school anymore. It was with the law. Outside that conference room, whispers began to move faster than facts. Students noticed the sudden appearance of unfamiliar adults in suits walking through the halls. Teachers were asked to report to the office. The superintendent of the district arrived before lunch. Meanwhile, Savannah, Chloe, and Rachel were summoned from class, each now aware that the video they thought was funny had become a national civil rights concern, and it didn't stop there. That same afternoon, Ariel's documentation was shared with her permission by a civil rights watchdog organization. The video was now paired with a larger narrative, Systemic Racism in Private Education, a Student's Story. The story spread across platforms, TikTok, Instagram Reels, even educational YouTube channels known for analyzing school culture and racial justice began picking it up. The keywords embedded in each post, civil rights, school discrimination, DOJ investigation, black student justice, school bullying lawsuit, boosted the reach with startling speed. By the evening, hashtags were trending. Justice for Ariel Silence is Power Westbridge. Exposed. That night, Ariel sat in her room, scrolling not through hate, but through waves of support. Former students from Westbridge began speaking up, sharing similar experiences they had kept buried for years. Parents from other schools messaged Isaiah directly, asking how they could push back against discrimination in their districts. Educators began requesting Ariel's permission to share her case as an example during diversity training. What had begun as one quiet girl's documentation had grown into a teachable movement. Meanwhile, inside Westbridge, consequences became unavoidable. Savannah was suspended immediately. Her parents attempted to push back, threatening to withdraw their $80,000 annual donation. But the school's legal team now advised against special treatment. Chloe and Rachel were given disciplinary contracts. They were required to attend sensitivity training and community service centered around racial equity, and to write a formal letter of accountability to Ariel. 3 teachers, including the one who dismissed Ariel's locker being vandalized, were placed under internal review. One resigned before the investigation began. But perhaps the most unexpected shift was among the students themselves. Once the silence cracked, empathy rushed in. A group of juniors launched a campaign called Listen First, encouraging their classmates to challenge passive bullying and report discrimination. Posters went up with phrases like, "Being quiet isn't weakness. It's watching who's worthy of your voice." Despite the sudden fame, Ariel never changed her rhythm. She still walked into school the same way, book in hand, headphones tucked into her pocket, eyes forward. But something had shifted. When she passed people in the halls, they didn't smirk anymore. They nodded. Some looked away, not out of disgust, but out of shame. The school invited her to speak at a student assembly. She declined. Instead, she submitted a single quote to be read aloud at the end of the meeting. "I was never asking to be seen. I just needed you to stop pretending I was invisible." What made this story hit harder than any viral outrage wasn't just the cruelty of the act, it was the calmness of the response. Ariel didn't retaliate with fire. She responded with structure, with dignity, with the rule of law. And her father, who had spent his entire career investigating cases of workplace discrimination, police misconduct, and civil rights violations. Called this the most personal case he had ever worked. What Westbridge learned the hard way was this: not every fight starts with yelling. Some of the most powerful reckonings begin with a notebook, a camera, and a girl who's been quiet long enough. The twist wasn't just that Ariel's father worked for the Department of Justice. The real twist was that she knew how the system worked and had been quietly building her case while they underestimated her. Justice didn't roar. It arrived quietly, professionally, and with receipts. And nothing was ever the same again. A month after the investigation began, Westbridge Academy looked the same from the outside: brick walls, trimmed lawns, banners advertising excellence and leadership. Inside, the atmosphere had changed. Hallway talk was softer, more deliberate. Teachers paused before answering questions about fitting in, and every classroom now displayed a small placard that read, "Respect is the minimum." Yet Ariel Ward remained exactly who she'd always been: the girl who preferred a novel to a selfie. She still entered the lunchroom with earbuds in her pocket and a book in her hand, but she never sat alone now. On most days, Jalen slid onto the bench first, followed by two girls from the Latinx Student Alliance and a junior who'd once laughed at her poem. They didn't crowd her. They simply shared the silence as if it were sacred space. Savannah returned from suspension quieter and noticeably humbler. No camera trailed her anymore. No clique carved a path for her through the hall. She attended mandated bullying prevention workshops and began an after-school project cataloging resources for diversity inclusion in local middle schools. Whether the change would last was anyone's guess, but small seeds were finally planted in soil that had been hard for too long. Ariel's father never gave a press statement. He let the official findings speak. The academy would overhaul its disciplinary policy, add mandatory civil rights training for staff, and partner with outside organizations to measure educational equity on campus. In the margin of the final report, Isaiah penciled 7 words: a promise to himself. Let this be the start, not closure. For him, justice was never an event. It was maintenance daily. Patient, uncompromising. On a chilly Friday, Westbridge hosted a community forum. Parents packed the auditorium, curious and uneasy. Ariel was invited to speak and, as always, declined. Instead, she asked Ms. Patterson, the teacher who'd been reassigned and later reinstated, to read a short piece she'd written the night before. I used to believe power was volume. Then I realized power is purpose. My silence was not absence, it was noticing. And when noticing met documentation, documentation met law, and law met accountability. If you choose to look away from injustice, the story will still unfold. You just won't get to help write the ending. The room stood in cautious applause. It wasn't thunderous, but it was honest. Later, while students gathered outside, a freshman approached Ariel and whispered, "Thank you for showing me silence can be strategy." Ariel smiled, then offered the girl her worn copy of Beloved. "Write your own margin notes," she said. That weekend, our channel's inbox filled with letters from educators asking permission to share Ariel's story in social justice curricula. Parents wrote about using the video to start dinner table conversations on cyberbullying and racial bias. One message came from a superintendent in another state. "Your story helped us identify a pattern we'd ignored. We're opening an investigation." Monday. These weren't viral numbers you could screenshot, but they were the kind of impact analytics can't capture: the slow recalibration of conscience. And that brings me to you, the listener. Maybe you're a student who's been told your quiet is weakness. Maybe you're a teacher overwhelmed by paperwork who misses the warning signs. Maybe you're a parent who trusts that a prestigious school equals a safe one. Wherever you stand, Remember, this silence is not the opposite of action. It's the space where action can be drafted, refined, and released with precision. Ariel's story isn't a call to rage. It's a masterclass in measured resistance, proof that social justice and legal accountability can work hand in hand when documentation meets courage. So, what now? If you witness harassment, log it, screenshot it, date it, protect it. If you're in leadership, audit your systems before someone else has to. And if you're the one being targeted, know that dignified stillness can carry nuclear potential, especially when paired with allies who understand the language of policy and precedent. Here at Radio Life Stories, we believe stories are blueprints. They map where we've failed and where we can rebuild. If Ariel's blueprint lit a path for you tonight, hit subscribe. Share this episode with one person who thinks silence equals surrender, and ring the bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into truth, resilience, and the quiet power that changes everything. Until then, stay observant, stay purposeful, and remember, the most devastating kind of justice is the one that arrives without raising its voice.